Pope Francis was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Wikipedia reports that he was born December 17, 1936 in Flores, which is a suburb of Buenos Aires in Argentina. He served as Pope from 2013 to 2025. He died at the age of 88. He was the first Jesuit Pope, the first Pope from the Americas, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, and the first that was born or raised outside of Europe since the 8th century. More background information from pbs.org tells us that Father Francis was born into Italian immigrants, and he loved and supported immigrants in his ministry. He was the eldest of 5 children. He was ordained a Jesuit priest in 1969 and led the religious order in Argentina during the country's murderous dictatorship from 1976 to 1983. He became Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998 and elevated to Cardinal in 2001 by Pope John Paul II. He was elected the 266th Pope on March 13, 2013, on the 5th ballot. If you know anything about the interesting way in which they choose a Pope. Among his other papal firsts, the first to visit Iraq, meeting its top Shiite Muslim cleric in 2021. And, most dear to my heart, for reasons that I will explain, he was the first to take the name of Francis after St. Francis of Assisi. More from PBS. Humility and simplicity. As an archbishop, Francis denied himself the luxuries his predecessors enjoyed, instead riding the bus, cooking his own meals, and often visiting slums. This continued in his years as Pope. He lived in the Vatican Hotel instead of the palace, breaking a tradition, says biography.com, that had been upheld by popes for more than a century. He wore his old orthodox shoes and not those red loafers of the papacy. And he set an example to other clergy by using compact cars. You go, Pope. As to his thoughts, LGBTQ+, he held a much more welcoming stance. When asked about a gay priest, he once said, "Who am I to judge?" In a 2023 interview, he declared that, quote, "being homosexual is not a crime," end quote. And he later approved blessings, though not marriage vows, for same-sex couples. Still a radical move. On the environment, Francis became the first pope to use scientific data in a major teaching document and made care for God's creation a hallmark of his papacy. In 2015, his environmental manifesto, Praised Be, which was its English name, urged a cultural revolution to correct what he called the structurally perverse global economic system that exploits the poor and turned Earth into a, quote, an immense pile of filth, unquote. It urges a shift from a profit-driven, exploitative system that harms both the environment and the poor to a more sustainable and just one. That cyclical was inspired by St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures. When Pope Francis visited Cuba and then America in 2015, I delivered a sermon about him, including here in this pulpit. It was called The Pope and I. The first time I heard the Catholic cardinals had elected a pope and that he chose to call himself by the name of Francis, I knew that we were in for something special. I rarely talk about it, but for a very brief period in my life, I was a participant in an Episcopal religious order. It was an order which at the time consisted of 2 people. But it was real. And I was ordained into it, as not as a monk, but as a friar, because I didn't live there. In the early 1980s, you see, I was working as a social worker in Savannah, Georgia, at a group home for delinquent teenage boys. A co-worker by the name of John had connections with the Florida diocese of the Episcopal diocese through a church in Newberry, which is a small town just west of Gainesville. Beautiful land with an empty home. A neighbor skirted the of a ravine. Brother John had acquired permission to begin his own residence facility for boys, and I was going to join him. This was the time in my life when I had left seminary around 5 years before. I had followed the call to ministry, but then abandoned my childhood Baptist faith and my Christian upbringing. Searching for some direction in my life, I went through graduate training in social work and served for a number of years. Yes, we have social workers there. But found it did not satisfy the pull that I felt inside. I had long been attracted to the mystical devotion of a monastic life. Ever since in seminary, I had studied the life of Thomas Merton, a Catholic monk who found a way to tread that razor's edge between complete and utter devotion to prayer and meditation and total immersion in a life of social justice. So Thomas Merton lived alone in a hermitage on the edge of the monastery. Yet he published more than 50 books on Zen and prayer and peace and nonviolence and Vietnam War resistance. He was a very special spiritual man. I wanted that in my life too, that kind of peace and inner purpose. The name I chose for myself, the name that Jorge Bergoglio chose for himself when he was named the 266th Pope, was Francis. Those of us who recognize that name most likely are familiar with that so-called prayer of St. Francis read for us earlier. Thank you, Ria. Beautiful prayer, though wrongly attributed to St. Francis. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Or we've seen the ubiquitous statues in the gardens with the birds perched on his shoulders, little animals gathered all around. St. Francis considered all nature as the mirror of God and called all creatures his brothers and sisters. Encyclopedia Britannica calls St. Francis of Assisi one of the most venerated religious figures in Roman Catholic history. It was an easy name for me to choose. So the name that our new Pope selected had a special meaning for me. Even more significant was the behavior he demonstrated in his office. One of the first things I remember hearing about Pope Francis was the washing of people's feet. You can see him doing it on YouTube. The twist is that while other popes have exercised this practice of humility, they have done it for other priests inside a Roman basilica. Pope Francis went to jail to wash the feet of young prisoners, as shown on CNN, many of them Muslims and atheists. He attended to the washing with great care, and he actually kissed their feet. From biography.com, we learn that he was a college professor in literature and psychology who studied theology at a doctoral level in Germany and who was voted Person of the Year by Time magazine in 2013. Stories of his humility abound. New York Times reported that around St. Peter's Square, the Pope offered services to the homeless and the migrants in ways that often did not go down well with his fellow clerics. In 2015, on PBS.org, Ben Greenberg wrote an essay titled, "I'm a Rabbi. Here's why Pope Francis inspires me." This is what he said. Pope Francis declared that religion has value and wisdom to offer to the world. When the Pope enacts a simpler approach to divorce, he recognizes that we are living in a new zeitgeist, and tradition must respond. When the Pope issues a sweeping encyclical on climate change, he demonstrates the power of traditional faith to call the masses to concrete action to be better stewards of our one and only earth. When the Pope washes and kisses the feet of a Muslim, he demonstrates religious humility in an era of increasing fundamentalism and polarization. With his every action, he demonstrates that the highest calling of a religious leader is to be a servant. End quote. And I would add to this, when the Pope says and does these things, he is reflecting the very principles which Unitarian Universalists have attempted to affirm and promote for generations. Yeah, the Pope and I, we're like this. He said whenever we do something together, something good, something beautiful, everyone changes. All of us change in some way, and this does us good. The Pope holds up a candle, said Rabbi Greenberg, illuminating a model of religious integrity that infuses hope into the clergy of all faiths. For people like myself, he wrote, who are not Catholic, he is not our teacher on doctrine or theology, but he is our teacher on how to be and live as emissaries of God in this world. The candle of integrity that he holds up against the darkness may only be one candle, but it is joined by the untold candles of people he inspires from all backgrounds. Jesus said, "Permit the children to come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Pope Francis did this everywhere he went. Without a hint of self-righteousness, he hugged them and he smiled with them and he cried with them. He rose to their level by falling to his knees. He let a little boy with Down syndrome ride the Pope-mobile. In a youth encounter in Manila, a young girl spoke to him of children in an orphanage, neglected by their parents, victims of drugs or abuse or prostitution. And the little girl broke down crying as she asked, "Father Francis, why is God allowing such things? And why are there only very few people willing to help?" The Pope was utterly transfixed by this, as any of us would be. And he responded, today, for which there is no answer. When the world is spinning madly, as it often seems to do, when it feels like we have no control in our own lives, and it's so hard to understand or find significance or meaning, and the ground is shaking underneath us, I believe it helps to be reminded of the fundamental truth expressed in our own principles, that we are part of something deep, sacred. Whether we call it religious faith or spiritual guidance or emotional stability or self-actualization. Francis said, although the life of a person is in a land full of thorns and weeds, there is always a space in which the good seed can grow. That is what religion says to me. That is what I think Pope Francis understood. Not that we must follow worn-out creeds and doctrines, but that we must love and serve the higher good. These days, there's a lot of poverty in the world, said Francis, and that's a scandal when we have so many riches and resources to give to everyone. We all have to think about how we can become a little poorer. There's a prayer that I keep tucked into my Bible. When life becomes too much with me, I take it out and read it. It's a prayer from Thomas Merton. I'd like to share it with you. I invite you not to get hung up on the religious language. Listen instead to the depth of longing in his words. I hear him crying out in existential angst, oh my God. It brings a sense of hope for me to know that someone who has spent far longer than myself in prayer and seeking and meditation and dedication to helping others, someone like Thomas Merton or Mother Teresa or Pope Francis, can feel the depth of loneliness or pain or doubt that I have felt. It gives me strength to live and carry on. From his work called Thoughts in Solitude, Merton wrote, My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. And I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, that though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen.